How to win. Short and sweet. You play through all 8 turns, then any Soviet units or German units that are out of supply, that cannot trace a supply line at that moment are eliminated, destroyed, and then you score points based on the following: a point for each step of each enemy that's in a destroyed box, and 1 victory point for each 2-step unit that's still on the map but on its reduced strength side, and then 2 points for every enemy supply source hex that you occupy. And then the German player gets 10 victory points in addition to all of that as a handicap to balance the game. And the person with the most victory points wins. That's the easy part. You get a very thorough, extended example of play while I'm here. I can show you pictures, and this is all this text and all these pictures, that's just covering the first turn. Then you have designer notes and game credits. So that's the rule book. All the main rules here are contained within just a few double-sided pages, 2 columns, smaller pages than what we're used to. The next thing I'd like to show you is the sequence of play. So the Soviet player goes first, and we have their supply reinforcement phase and their combat phase, then their movement phase. That's interesting right there. And finally the recovery phase. German player takes their turn, same phases, same orders pertaining to them. Then the housekeeping phase, very easy, move the turn, roll to determine if we have mud, I think 1 or 2. Yes, on a 1 or 2, the ground conditions change to mud, and you push it forward. The zones of control in this game are fluid, inactive, and suppressive. That's taken from the War Games Handbook, but anyway, they're fluid in the sense that you can, if you move into an enemy zone of control in your next movement phase, you can move out of it. You don't have to pay any movement costs to do so, however. Which would make sense because most of the time it's 1, maybe 2 hexes. You don't really have a movement allowance in the same sense that you do in other games. Inactive, because you're not obligated to attack units in your zone of control during your combat phase. You can pick and choose. You can choose to attack none. And suppressive, because and that pertains to how you trace your supply line. And if the enemy zones of control block the passage of a supply line unless those hexes are occupied by friendly units. The same thing goes for enemy supply source hexes. Okay, so I hope I used those terms correctly. So the first phase of each player's turn is a supply and reinforcement phase. So what you first do is you determine the supply status of each of your units on the board. And any that are out of supply, you get this little marker placed on it until it's back in supply again, at which point at the beginning of your turn you can remove it. This marker basically reminds you that that unit that's currently out of supply can only move 1 hex per turn, regardless of whether, even if it's a cavalry or fast unit during snow turns. There are also some negative column shifts on the combat table, basically, and there are actually 4 different conditions here. If all units in attacked hex are unsupplied, there's 2 column shifts to the right. If some, only 1. And then if all attacking units are unsupplied, that's 2 to the left. If only some are, then 1 to the left. Remember, it could be a combination of the 2. So, like I said, they're cumulative. You can potentially go back and forth determining, finally, where you roll. There are also some special rules that are turn-specific. We'll not get into those quite yet. And then after you're done with that, placing any of these if necessary, you move into your reinforcement phase, and, well, the Soviet player gets none on the first turn. Those two units, both German Panzer units, that come into play during turn 1. So then it's the combat phase. And the combat sequence here, we get, designation, determined combat strengths, your typical stuff. The only difference here that from what we've seen before is whether or not you want to declare an all-out attack as far as the sequence goes. There are, however, major differences in the combat results table. And what I didn't mention yet, and I kind of alluded to in the beginning, is stacking. There is no stacking limit. There's no stacking limit in this game, which is, very different. And basically, it's you could, if you wanted, put, all of your, a lot of your units, if not all of them, in a hex together and just pile them up. And I'm not sure why anyone would do that, but it's not, it wouldn't be illegal. It wouldn't be breaking the rules. And the rules, instead of mandating these hard set limits in the form of the stacking limit, maximum occupancy, they handle it in a couple of different ways, and in relation to combat. The first, they call it, the designer calls it over-concentration. So if you have 5 or more non-retreating units in a hex, and you're being attacked, then the attacker will, that's considered an over-concentrated hex, and in kind of like a shooting fish in a barrel kind of sense, it's easier, to inflict more damage. So they would get to apply the higher result. So there's a normal, there are 2 numbers separated by a slash, and these are number of hits inflicted. And so the number on the left is under normal conditions, and the number on the right would be for all-out attacks, or when hexes are over-concentrated losses. Here's a reminder down here. Another thing is, if you're in a situation like this, and it's your combat phase, you couldn't attack with all of those units to this hex, obviously. There's a maximum of 2 units that can attack over any particular hex site. There's another rule that I forgot to mention when it comes to defending. In addition to the possibility of having to deal with the over-concentration losses, you can only, when defending, if you're the German player, select, you would take 3 of your strongest units, and you combine their combat strength as your total defense value. For the Soviet player, it's only 2. So there are a couple of ways in which those are handled. So it gives you the sense of more freedom, I think. Maybe striving for more realism. I'm not qualified at this moment to say, but it's interesting, and we'll see it in action during my playthrough coming up here next. So there's that. And another thing you'll notice is that, especially down here, here's the setup, the hexes are very large, and that's because instead of stacking, like I said, there's no stacking limit anyway, they give you more space to kind of spread out your units within the hex. So you can see them, and I think there's maybe visually more fluidity, more, I don't know if that's the right word, yet another way in which you can you can use space on the board. This gives you a very different sense, in my opinion, than that, or that, and so that's pretty neat. Knowing that probably people won't have many more than 4 units in the hex at any given time, maybe 5. Yes, and the all-out attack is basically an option that you can choose to enact by, as long as one of the units you're attacking with is a full strength 2-step unit. You can flip it to its reduced strength side in exchange for these better numbers here. During an all-out attack, if one of your attacking units is a full strength 2-step tank or panzer unit, then that is the unit that must suffer the step loss. You don't get a choice about it. Otherwise, you can choose any of your full strength 2-step units to suffer the step loss. This whole combat results table, this looks very different from what I'm used to, but it's an odds ratio based table, and instead of the DEAR kind of results, we got numbers instead. I don't know, is that common? I haven't seen a lot of games, so I wouldn't be able to know, but it feels like maybe it's not. It's pretty unique. We'll find out later on. We'll find out a lot of things as we go. Going back to the combat sequence here, so designation. You don't have to declare all your battles at the beginning of your combat phase. You can declare one, resolve it, declare the next. So then we just talked about all of that. And then applying the combat result. So there is an option of retreating instead of inflicting the final hit. If 2 or more hits are inflicted upon defending Soviet forces, they must absorb that final hit as a retreat, or by retreating. They don't have an option to choose one or the other. So what does that mean? That means their units get this marker placed on it, and that means that for a whole turn that unit cannot attack, cannot defend, cannot move, cannot do anything basically, and they don't even count as defending units when their hex is being attacked. They're just completely ignored. And at the end of each player's turn, there's something called the recovery phase, and that's when you can remove any retreated markers from your unit. So it affects them for the whole following turn. Units, this is reading from the rulebook, units must retreat into hexes that are not in an enemy zone of control if possible. If no such hex is available to retreat into, only then can they retreat into friendly occupied hexes that are in enemy zones of control. There's a special rule that pertains to retreating from a friendly supply source hex. If you are starting in a friendly supply source hex and you're retreating, you must retreat to another, an adjacent friendly supply source hex. And if that is in an enemy zone of control, then that hex must be occupied by a friendly unit. Let's say it's your opponent's combat phase and you have a retreating unit in the same hex as a non-retreating unit. That hex is attacked. If the non-retreating unit is eliminated or is forced to retreat, then any retreating units that were occupying the attacked hex, well, they're eliminated. Then after combat, you have your movement phase, and you cannot pass through hexes that are enemy occupied. And then during the final recovery phase, part of your turn, you just remove any of these markers that are on your units. Finally, you get a couple of pages of these special rules. There are a lot of special rules. Those are turn specific. Game turn 1. All of these conditions apply. Game turn 2, game turn 3, 4, 5, and 7. So we're skipping 4 and 6. And then game turn 8. So I won't go over these, but there's a big chunk of rules in here that are even reflected on the terrain effects chart when it comes to these locations here. You'll see these little icons. Anyway, those have to do with the special rules, and there's also one of these. Oh, there we go. A reminder for one of them. On the flip side of one of these out of supply markers. I didn't even notice that till recently. The special rules for game turn 8 is where we'll see the procedure for any German units attempting to break out to friendly lines. There's, I think, a little mistake here. If I'm correct, it should say if the modified roll is 5 or more, that unit breaks out. And instead of the unit is placed in a destroyed box where it would count as victory points for your opponents, it's removed from play. And on any other result, then the unit would be considered eliminated and placed in a destroyed box. Eliminated and destroyed are synonymous in this rulebook, I think. And I think I read that. Okay, pulled up the Wikipedia page of the Battle of the Korsun-Cherkasy Pocket. Interesting. Yes, this is where I saw it, of course. First paragraph, last sentence. The encircled German units broke out in coordination with a relief attempt by other German forces, with roughly 2 out of 3 encircled men succeeding in escaping the pocket, almost 1/3 of their men dead or prisoners. Yes, so that's where I saw that. I can't remember if I mentioned it, but that is that's the game.